I've been studying Ernest Holmes for a long time, and I'm pretty familiar with his work. For any of you who he is a name you don't know, or you're just now learning his name, or you're in varying degrees of being familiar with him, his writing is beautiful. It's poetic. It's profound. It's sometimes overwhelming in its strength and power, and sometimes it takes a moment to figure out what he's saying, but it's like a really good candy bar. It's worth getting to the middle, you know what I'm saying? So there is a passage, there's something in his work that I have read. I've been familiar with this for a long time, and I've always wondered really what it meant. It's just gorgeous, but I said, how is it? I'm someone I need tangible, I need tactile. I'm kind of a blue collar person. I just really need to know what does this mean? And recently, I've had about three things come together to open up to me what this means, and they all have to do with joy. And I want to share this with you today. My three things. So Ernest Holmes says, as we gaze longingly at joy, it will make its home with us. As we gaze longingly at joy, it will make its home with us, and we shall enter into it and be happy. I thought, what? I mean, that's gorgeous, right? It's like, what does that mean? You know? So recently, because what he's saying there is that joy seems to have a healing quality, and yet we will enter into it. But my thinking is, but don't we have to create joy? I mean, he's putting joy in the first piece, like, hey Andy, why are you so happy? I won the lottery. Okay, I get it. I mean, no, there's joy there, but joy, just for joy's sake, as a healing quality. So recently, as has been mentioned today, I work for Skyway House, and one of my jobs is I spend in excess of 6 hours a week in groups, sometimes more, just doing groups with people, and giving information out there, getting people to process it, having a conversation about, what is addiction, what is recovery, how do we live with this in our lives and things like that. And so I have this kind of formula I always use. I say, okay, let's say my group is 2 hours long. So I go, okay, for the first hour, I will get into the disease because, oh my God, that's so dark and ugly and gross. I want to throw up on myself, and it's just tough, and all the stuff that went wrong, and it's hard to look at. Then the second hour, we go into recovery, which is beautiful and light and lofty and feels good and, and angelic and transformational. And so I have this formula. And so what I notice is sometimes in the first hour, it's like, when you're done, people just like, thank you for the root canal. Okay. Are we done now? I mean, I've been there, done that, and it's like, okay, well, the recovery's coming, so just hang on. And sometimes it's a little hard to get into the recovery because there's a excuse the expression, there's a hangover of shame, right? There's a hangover of darkness and gray and everything like that. And so anyway, I did something a few weeks ago. I had this material I was doing, and I just could not have it be that way. I had to set it up with the recovery to go into the addiction part of it. It's just like, okay, well, gee, I'm going to have to break that. I don't, and I was upset and I was pouting and stuff, but I did it. I put it together that way. And so I did the material, started out with the recovery piece, and man, everybody came to light. They walk in going, okay, Andy, okay, pull out your shotgun and let us have it, But no, I didn't have my shotgun that day. And so we got into the recovery part of it. Everyone was all into it. And then I moved into the addiction part of it, and it was so beautiful because they brought all that joy into it and they illuminated it. It was amazing, And I thought, that's what Ernest Holmes is talking about. Let us gaze upon joy long enough, to where we can begin to bring it forward. And no matter what comes, whatever we have to deal with, it's almost like a light that we take with us, you know? When I was growing up, both my parents were depression people. They came out of the Great Depression. I'm a baby boomer, and baby boomers, that's one of the things we always heard about, this thing called the Depression, right? And so in my family, my father's family was not impacted as much as a lot of families were. On my mom's family, they were impacted just horrendously by the Depression. My mom's mom and dad came to California from Colorado at just the right time to catch, the great downturn of all kinds of economic problems. The Dust Bowl had been going on, all kinds of stuff was happening. They go to California because to them, California was streets of gold, and that's what they thought about. And so we're going to go to California, and they'd just been married, and we're going to have our children, and California's going to be great. And so they came out here, and they, neither one of them had completed their education. My grandmother worked. She is from a kid up. She cooked meals on a ranch, her father's ranch, and my grandfather was, he worked in farming and things like that, in those kinds of families. And so they came west, and so they went to work in agriculture. And they were for a while migrant farm workers, and then eventually settled into one particular farm in the San Jose area, Cupertino. When Cupertino and San Jose was just hundreds of miles of some of the most beautiful orchards in the world, peaches and prunes and apricots and all those things. My mom talked about she cut her teeth on an apricot bucket. And because when it came time to pick and stuff, everybody, my mom was working in packing sheds as a little girl. She was picking crops as a little girl. And so they lived in farm housing and stuff. So why this is even coming up is because as a spoiled brat baby boomer that I was, and I came into the material world, and I was being advertised to on TV and stuff, for G.I. Joe and all that stuff, And my parent, my dad was a person who made a good living and provided for us. And so Christmas would come, and our house, all of a sudden, my mom would go nuts over oranges. They would start popping up in the house. But she didn't just have, she would have, my mom, she loved to decorate and stuff, and she'd have little bowls, and she'd put, oranges in them. And they'd be around, and I noticed they were just kind of around. And because I was more interested in candy and things like that, I know you can't tell, but that was my thing. These were pretty healthy. I was kind of worried about those, and so then my sister and I, our Christmas stockings, along with some other things, always had a couple of oranges in them. And this one day, it was a really bratty moment on my part. I said, "Mom, what's with you and these oranges at Christmas? What's the deal with you? It's almost like, do you have a mental health issue or something that you haven't told me about, And so, and I could see I kind of, hurt her feelings. And it's like, And so when I put my ego back where it belonged, I approached her later and I said, "Why are oranges so important to you?" And she talked about, to her credit, she actually talked to me. And she said, how I grew up, and there were 3 or 4 years that were particularly hard for us because her mom, my grandmother, among all the other challenges, had illnesses that had put her in bed for a couple of months at a time in the house. She wasn't in some hospital somewhere, and there were other women, we would call them midwives now or whatever. They would come and attend to her, and my mom's older sister took care of her mom, but then also took care of everybody else. And it was really tough financially. And so my grandparents apparently got their hands on a few oranges because, now we don't think of it, but at that time, they were scarce until a certain time of the year. They got their hands on a few oranges and they put them in the house. And they had 5 children, but only 4 that were old enough to really know what was going on. And so there was a bowl in the house, and they placed 4 or 5 oranges in the bowl, and they said, each orange is for you, but you can't get them until Christmas. You can't open them until Christmas. And my mom said they knew there wasn't much going on for Christmas that year, but they would go from time to time. And so they would pick their orange, and they would argue over their orange, and they would hold their orange. And, orange is like a baseball. You can't help it, just kind of mess with it, And you know what's in there, but what's it really like in there in terms of what are the slices like and stuff? And my mom said that it brought joy into the season, and they couldn't wait to get up in the morning to, among other things, each get their orange. And then the beautiful thing is, and this is really interesting psychologically, was that they had their own orange, but my mom said they loved so much sharing it with each other. Because an orange is a fruit that's already ready to go. Oranges are ready to share. That's the way isn't that beautiful? And they did this for, like I said, 2 or 3 Christmases or 4 Christmases when it was really difficult. And she said, Andy, I just wanted to share this with you. And man, I felt really bad. What's really interesting about it, the more I talked to her, was that, when someone is telling you a story, you know how you get this mental image kind of. I never knew what that place looked like where they lived. I never was there, obviously, but I think of it as not much light, kind of dark, not much furniture, not very many rooms. And she talked about how beautiful they are. She talked about them being like gold. And they're a fruit that smells as good as it tastes. And she said it's exotic. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, when we were kids, we'd hear about them. They came from Florida or Southern California, And it made us feel, it was kind of like feeling wealthy. And that joy moved forward with that family to be able to, over the next few years, together build a decent life. As Ernest Holmes says, to gaze upon the joy long enough, So that's number 1. Number 2. No, number 1 was the groups. Number 2 is my mom. Now this is number 3. A while back, I was listening to Fresh Air with Terry Gross on NPR, and she was interviewing Joel Grey, who we all know him from Cabaret, and now I guess he's a director in the theater in his older age, and he is the person who's directing in New York the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof. So it's Fiddler on the Roof in nothing but Yiddish, okay? And so she had Joel Grey on, and the gentleman who plays Tevye, whose name is Steven Skybell, okay? And so they were talking about how this Fiddler on the Roof is not just Yiddish, but Joel Grey has put a different spin on it. He said, I wanted to come into these people who, where they were in history, which I believe was they were Jews who were living in Russia, and they were being, tormented to leave Russia. And he said, I want you to think of them in 2 ways. Number 1, that they were people preparing to become refugees. And number 2, what was laying ahead of them that we all know in the world? Holocaust, fascism, communism, no matter where they went. And so there's a poignant scene. So his Fiddler on the Roof is Yiddish, and it has all that joy and has all that, all those wonderful songs, but there's this idea of these people. What are they heading out to? Which becomes poignant in a particular place. And I want to explain to you what that poignancy is. So Tevye, who was played before on stage by Zero Mostel, and then later in the movie by Cham Topol, those gentlemen who kind of became the cookie cutter Tevye were a little bit stocky. They were a little bit comic. They had these outsized charismatic ways. They were jovial, and they would come into a room and they would fill the room with their presence. And in the Yiddish version, Joel Grey wanted Tevye to have the charisma of a working Jew who loved his family, who was a little more grounded, a little more spiritual. He was physically smaller and occupied a sweet, quieter space. Okay? So a time comes, we all know the story, and the family needs to move on. And there's that great scene where they're all leaving, and then the mythical character is up on that pitched roof, the fiddler. Now, what the fiddler represents is being able to create beautiful music, the music of life, while in a precarious position. And how do you do that? You do it through tradition and spirituality and family and connection, so you don't fall off and hurt yourself. The fiddler is a magical character, a mythological character. He is a character that brings people joy in the midst of the precariousness of life. So the family is leaving, and the Joel Grey version of Tevye is not so much, okay, come on, like Zero would have done it, which was beautiful. But this Tevye is like, looks back and says, please, please come with us. We don't know where we're going. And in that moment, because the audience is in the future, Joel Grey says it invites them into, yeah, please go with them. They're going into places they can't even imagine. And they need the joy. They need the joy to go with them. This has become so poignant for me because I think, and I was shared a little bit about this earlier in the service. We talk about, where are you, Center for Spiritual Living, your own traditions. Why do our spiritual traditions mean so much to us? There's an aspect of it that is celebratory, joyous. It tells us who we are. It gives us hope and faith. It gives us the light that we need when times are dark. Imagine this Christmas season without its religious overlays to it, its spiritual ideas. In the midst of winter, in the midst of darker days, imagine what our life would be like without this gorgeous celebration that brings us joy. I mean, you can't look at a Christmas tree this lit without just smiling. You can't do it. It's impossible. I've tried. I've done experiments. I have found grumpy people and made them look at Christmas trees, and they smile. You know what I'm saying? Why? Because of what it represents. And so, there's this elf thing going on here for Skyway House with these gifts, and I've worked a couple Christmases at Skyway House. I've worked a couple Christmas mornings, and I've watched them open them up. I'm talking, people who have been down some rough roads. There's some hard-boiled people who have been through tough life, people who have. It's hard to smile. It's hard to feel good. And, you watch a 45, 50-year-old, alcoholic who has been down some roads and lived a tough life, and watch his face light up when he opens that box. It's amazing. This is what Holmes was saying. If we gaze upon joy long enough, it becomes a part of healing. My greatest wish for all of you is that you have your own fiddler and you say, come on, let's go through this together. Anyway, this is my official December thing, so I want to say Merry Christmas to all of you, all right? And would you guys like to come back up, please? Thank you.
Well, since he mentioned